Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm Valora Washington of the CAYL Institute, and it's my privilege to be able to greet you today and welcome you to our webinar on honoring family voices. This is a really important topic that we're bringing to you today, and we really look forward to hearing from our two dynamic speakers to talk about how we might do an even better job of reaching out and communicating with families. So welcome and welcome back. We are the CAYL Institute, and there are very many things that we stand for: representative leadership, making sure that the voices of people in the field, practitioners, are heard. We have a very strong commitment to diversity. We're focused on solutions, we're focused on impact, and we really are focused on building and sharing knowledge. So welcome. These are the values we present to you in all of the webinars that we're doing in this series. So we're really delighted that so many of you have joined us and continue to communicate with us about topics you're interested in and how important this webinar series has been to you. We've throughout this year really focused a lot on innovation, impact, and imagination. And we really have thought a lot about what Albert Einstein has had to say about some of these topics. And as we turn to impact, we're really thinking about his words that the destiny of civilized humanity depends more than ever on the moral forces that it's capable of generating. When we started this year, we thought a lot about imagination and what it would really take for us to imagine a new vision for our children, our families, and ourselves as early childhood educators. And we were inspired by Albert Einstein's telling us that imagination is so much more important than knowledge. And then we turn to innovation as we begin to think about what innovative things could we imagine. And we brought forth very many topics. We've talked about universal childcare. We've talked about 21st century kindergarten and many other topics as we thought about how we could imagine a different world for ourselves and how we could innovate. But now we're turning to impact as we finish the year and go through the rest of the year. What is the impact that we're really having on children? What's the impact that we're having on our programs? And we're going to end the year thinking about quality rating systems and the impact they're having on our field and the possibilities they can have for our field. So welcome to the next few months as we think together about the impact that we want to have. Many of you might have been aware that we were expecting today a speaker, Tammy Dunn. She's had a personal emergency and will not be able to join us today. But we do have two very innovative, very strong, and important new voices in the field to really talk about how we can better honor families. Let me introduce you to the two dynamic women we're going to hear from today. First, we're going to hear from Nina Perez, who's going to talk with us about Moms Rising. She's going to talk with us about her work that she's been doing in Moms Rising to really lift up families and lift up family voices and the experience and expertise that families bring to the table. Nina is a really fascinating new voice in our field, where she really emphasizes storytelling. She emphasizes parent leadership, community outreach. She's really focused on language access and making sure that we're reaching people in a variety of languages. And her really main focus and passions are on human rights, social theory, women's rights, racial equity, early education, of course, and anti-poverty work. And in her work at Moms Rising, she's really helping to center family voices in the change that we seek. She is really trying to work hard on multilingual campaigns. She's worked on several issue areas, including childcare, healthcare, and also pregnancy discrimination. So we're really looking forward to hearing what she has to say about rising family voices and including family voices. We also have for you today another dynamic new leader, and that is Latoya Gale. Latoya describes herself as a social entrepreneur, and I agree with her, and you'll see why. She really has founded and been involved in a lot of nonprofit organizations. Let me give you a few examples. So she really was involved with something called March Like a Mother. I like that name, March Like a Mother. And she started this with Black moms in Boston to really leverage their collective and transformative power, their power as mothers to eradicate systemic racism. Isn't that very powerful? She's also consulted a lot on community engagement and investment strategies and was involved in a civic engagement lab focused on building the capacity of families to advocate for education. She's also worked as a racial equity strategist with the Disruptive Equity Education Project. Yes, that's right, the Disruptive Equity Education Project. And it was a professional development strategy that was focused on intentional, developmental, and complex work around equity. So, as we can see, both of these women have deep engagement in community, deep engagement with empowering others and building community, and working as change agents in their community. So I'm really glad to welcome them today. I want to remind all of you that this webinar is being recorded. It's being recorded because many of our colleagues, as you know, are working with children at this hour and cannot listen right now. So by recording it, they can listen at their leisure. This webinar is also closed caption, and if you want closed caption, please click the CC button at the bottom of your screen and you'll be able to do it. We hope that you're writing in the chat and asking questions as we go along. And also, I want to remind you that at the end of this webinar, those of you who've been with us will remember this, we're going to give you a link. And if you press that link at the end of the webinar, it's going to connect you to an opportunity for personal interaction with our panelists today. So we hope that you'll join us at the end of this webinar to communicate with them. A lot of what we're doing is really based on a lot of the work that the CAYL Institute has done. The CAYL Institute has produced a lot of books or several books about being a change agent and the things that we can do to make a difference in our world. And so we invite you to think about how you can be that new early childhood professional that makes a difference as we fight the battles and make the progress that we're wanting to make for our children, our families, and ourselves. So as we move forward and think about honoring family voices, I invite you to listen to what these two women have to say about what families are asking for right now, to see how you might engage with some of the strategies that they're putting forward, and to ask questions and hear about how all of our work can give more respect and honor to the families that we serve. I'm asking us to think today about family leadership, if we really have made space for family leadership, how we can engage, leverage, and support parent activism, and really understand how we can better bond with families as our allies. So let's get started thinking about honoring family voices. And we're going to get started by listening to Nina Perez. Nina, welcome. We're so glad you're here with us today and really look forward to hearing what you have to say. Welcome, Nina.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to the CAYL Institute for having all of us into this amazing conversation. As Zerdin said, I'm Nina Perez. I'm the Early Childhood Director at Moms Rising, Mamás con Poder. So I was thinking I'm first going to talk a little bit about Moms Rising, just so for folks who aren't familiar. And then what I'm hoping to do is to have a conversation with all of you about how we center families in policy discussions, how we build legislation around families, how we center parents in leadership, and what does that practically look like? Because I think we talk about that a lot, but then when it gets to the nuts and bolts is where I think it gets more complicated. So to start, Moms Rising, Mamás con Poder is a national online on-the-ground organization, grassroots organization with more than 1 million moms and families across the country. And we are a bilingual organization. And so we also are Mamás con Poder, which means that we have an entire community that is Spanish speaking. And we don't do that merely through translation, but through specific creative content for that community, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later, because I think that's really important when we talk about multilingual communities. is how is it that we aren't just doing translation, but how is it that we're being responsive? And we are a multi-issue and intersectional organization as we advance our mission for family economic security, decrease discrimination, and build a nation where both businesses and families can thrive. So some of the things that we work on, for example, are workplace justice, healthcare, childcare and early learning, maternal justice, gun control and safety. And it really runs the gamut. And the reason for that is because we know that people don't live single issue lives. And that in order to really be able to meet the needs of families and to be responsive to the change that they want to see in the world, we have to be seeing them as whole people and understanding the complexity of the various issues that are impacting their lives at once. So a little bit about me before I get into kind of our strategy. I actually was not a mom when I came into this work. And I always think that's really important because I think the things that break our hearts, that bring us into creating change, into activism or advocacy or organizing, is that thing that first breaks your heart and makes you want to see something different. And for me, it really was my own mother who was forced out of the workforce because she couldn't access childcare. First with my sister and then with myself. And my mother would have actually been one of the beneficiaries of universal childcare had Nixon not vetoed it when he did. And so it's amazing the ripple effect that it's had for my mother. She was never quite able to get back in the workforce because at the same time that technology came aboard, and every time she tried to make it back in, met barrier after barrier because of work experience and all these different things. So that is what brings me to this work, what initially brought me to this work, just to anchor us. And what really keeps me in this work now is my own daughter. I have a 3-year-old who's about to start preschool next week. And I know firsthand now the challenges of accessing childcare and the importance of high quality education. I just met my daughter's teacher today, and she's amazing and fabulous. And we talked about conscious discipline, and it's so incredible to be able to have that relationship with your provider and educators in that way. And I just feel so grateful. And it was also still so hard to access for us, even knowing everything we know. So there's so much work to do and so much amazingness that's already happening. And I'm just very honored to be in this work for my mother, for myself, and for my daughter now. Hopefully we can improve things by the time she decides, if she decides to do so, have her own family. So a little bit more about Moms Rising, now that you know about me. We are a listening organization. So when we talk about how we center families in policy making and decision making, that is very much at every step of the process. So we listen, and then we take what we hear, and we either engage with families more deeply to have them do as much as decision making on processes that we're doing or our mission statements, to trying to inform legislation directly. But we also just listen to the feedback. Every Monday when we sit down at our weekly meetings, we start the meetings by listening to feedback from our members that have come in through either staff or through our contact line. And it is really, that is our success, is opening as many avenues of engagement as possible at the same time, so that busy people can choose what they have time to do in a given moment, and listening. And if you listen, you can catch so many things. I think we sometimes get so goal oriented as advocates that we forget to do that piece and think about what are the consequences or benefits of things that we're doing. And really that a lot of different pieces working together at the same time are most effective. So what do I mean by that? Moms Rising uses a structure of organizing called layer cake organizing. That means that we have a lot of different pieces to make the delicious cake, right? You need the batter, you need the eggs, I obviously haven't made a cake recently because I'm messing up the ingredients, but all of the sugar, all the different things to make a delicious cake, right? And no layer is more important than the other. So when we talk about engaging families, we give them lots of options, and we provide a lot of different options as well. As a way of being responsive to families, one of the things that, always is something that comes straight up to mind for me that frustrates me is when people are like, it's so hard to engage families. I'll create this event and they don't show up or something like that. And I'm like, well, what kind of options did you provide? Because families are in so many different places at different points of their life, particularly when you think of folks like the sandwich generation who are often caring for children and adults. And in-person events, particularly during work hours, for example, are going to be really, really difficult for families to make, depending on what's going on in their life. But there are also just points of their life, like back to school. We're in the back to school time right now. And we get all these requests like, do you have a parent who wants to do this? And I was like, this is the time of the year where we should be asking parents nothing, because they're just trying to get their lives together with their kids. And so it's about being responsive and providing a lot of different options and making sure that you're building that power in ways that is responsive to the family. When I talk about that layer cake model, the components that are in that are what we call synergistic collaboration, which is that we don't believe in doing this work just by ourselves. We have hundreds and hundreds of partners, not just policy partners, but research partners and other grassroots partners, unions, provider organizations. I firmly believe that in the childcare work, we need to constantly be working together as parents and providers and early educators to move these issues forward. If we aren't talking to providers and we aren't talking to early educators and we're helping determine policy, we could be creating harm without realizing to some of those most impacted by these issues. So it's about constant collaboration and making sure that we're covering our bases and also just building power together. The more of us doing this work together, the better it's going to be. We also have what we call one-click advocacy. To that same point of someone being really busy, we try to provide opportunities for folks to weigh in and have their voice heard that is as easy as clicking a button in your email. So those are petitions and letters to the editor, where we try to pre-populate the information and make it really easy for people to edit with their personal experience if they want to in their local paper. We also ask people to submit stories. I'll be talking more about story sharing in a bit, but one of the things that I always think is so interesting is, oftentimes the storytellers that we work with and then build relationships with and who end up being our volunteers will say, that they found us in, there's one mom in California, Marisol, who made me laugh. She's like, you all literally found me where I was at a particular time at 3 a.m. on Twitter, scrolling Twitter while I was breastfeeding my son. I saw you ask for stories and I was like, oh, I have this experience. Let me, just like, and I typed it while I was on the phone feeding him. And then now she's a fantastic volunteer. And so it's about really creating these opportunities to meet people where they are in real ways. Member voice proxy is the next layer that we often talk about. This is where we make sure that folks' voices are present. Not everybody can go to DC, for example. So I work on national federal childcare. If I could bring every single parent to DC, if we had the funding to do that, I would do that. But for folks who also just can't make it, for example, when I worked on healthcare, there were just a lot of families with medically fragile children who just could not make the trip to DC in a way that they felt safe doing it. We create what we call these member voice proxies, which is a storybook or a activity that the family does together that then we deliver directly to members of Congress. That can look like kites that are decorated with messages from families, or postcards or bibs or onesies. We've done so many. I could go on, but with the kites, it's always my favorite because we had so many messages written by families and children with lots of glitter. And there's just something fantastic about bringing glitter to Congress in a way that, just really makes real for them in a longevity of what we're talking about. We also do on-the-ground engagement. We do have on-the-ground events. We make them responsive to families, and I'll go more into detail on that later. Story sharing. We also do a lot with media, both traditional and new media, with public education and engagement. With the media, this has really been, to me, one of the success points of childcare in the last few years, is that there was a time where we couldn't get anyone to talk about childcare in the media. And all of a sudden, unfortunately, because of the pandemic, but one of the silver linings is that we were able to finally help have this recognition moment that childcare needed a solution, that there was a systemic inequality there, and really identifying the problem as the first step to solving the problems within it. And I think we really achieved that through the work with the media, and many of that was through our storytellers and our volunteers who have just been fantastic. And then last is cultivating legislative champions. Is how is it that we make sure that our families have direct relationship with their members of Congress, understand how to check in with their members of Congress, and how we're identifying champions on an issue, but also cultivating new ones. So that's a little bit about our structure. And now I'm going to go deep on the way that we engage with families. So why partner with families? I think this is always a question folks ask themselves, and one of the things that people ask us often, despite being Moms Rising, mostly because I think there's an understanding that because of the flexibility needed and the resources needed, it can be hard for organizations to engage families if they don't have the resources and the dedication to these particular components. So what I say is, when we engage with parents early and often in policy planning, we're going to develop the policies that we know are going to work for children and families. It's when we center those most impacted and we get their feedback, we're going to make good policy. And it's often when policymakers have made policy without engaging with stakeholders who are impacted by this, that we see harm happen in them. So to engage early means that we're going to develop the best solutions. Support effective policy implementation by centering those most impacted. If you've been having conversations with families or providers in the case of early childhood, early on throughout the process, in the development, they've been part of developing the legislative process, they're going to be better advocates for that same piece of legislation. And not only is it better legislation, but now they can go into their communities and talk about it with such confidence and be champions for it in a way that's unique, because they have a stake in it, a real stake in it, because they've been there all along. To mobilize parents and caregivers to pass important policies. If you want someone to be passionate about a policy that you want passed, they should be a part of the process in some way or another, or understand it from the very beginning. And there's no better messenger to families about some of these issues than other families. I am an early childhood advocate, and I've worked in early childhood for a long time. And it was still word of mouth how I found out about my local childcare, and any decision that I would assume on local childcare would be impacted by word of mouth. And so I think that we are also just great messengers for each other as families. If you have parents involved in the planning process of an event, and if you center families and build from there, it's just going to be a more successful event overall. And the reason I say that is because I think there's always this, particularly with policy, there's always this desire to start with the policy makers, like, Congressman is so busy, like we have to start with their schedule and then the families in. But I would say we always need to do the opposite. We center families first and then go from there. And I'll give an example of that. But so if we first start, how do we do this work? We first start by creating a safe space. What does that mean? We say that a lot in the field. What does it mean to create a safe space? Well, a space where your family and your children can be in a real way, and also by building relationships. I think that especially with storytelling, there's something so incredibly vulnerable, and if you're not careful, re-traumatizing about sharing your experiences. We have so many people now sharing their healthcare stories related to maternal health, around recent Supreme Court decisions. We've had people sharing about their medically fragile children, about losing their housing, about, these are incredibly vulnerable stories that can open up wounds. And so it's really important that you build relationship, and that you, again, listen to where people are and what they want to share and what they don't want to do in these different situations. And that is part of building that trust and creating that space. Intentional partnerships with families. I think one of the things that we always say it's really important is that a storyteller should not be a storyteller alone. I think sometimes we hear the word storyteller and we think, oh, someone's sharing their story and then we're done. We get asked a lot of questions about story banking, like how is it that you have a bank of stories that you can kind of like propel? But the reality is that the intentional partnership with families and then intentional time with families is what makes us effective and what makes the work effective, because we understand where our families are coming from. We know when they're too busy to do something, to do a media interview. We know when they've had enough, or when we shouldn't have them in front of media at all because they're not comfortable with it. it's about really creating those intentional relationships. I often know with the parents that I work with when their kids' birthdays are, it's really about relationship building in a real way. And flexibility and responsiveness is another piece that I think is really important. If you create flexible events, then parents are really going to be able to come. So what does that look like in a practical sense? Well, there was a time where I was doing listening sessions across, I live in Florida now, but I used to live in the District of Columbia, and we did listening sessions across the city. I knew that I wanted them to be child-friendly spaces with an integrated childcare model. What do I mean by that? So I think sometimes when people plan events, they think, well, I'll have an event at this time and I'll offer childcare. Some people don't offer childcare at all, but if they offer childcare and then they're like, check mark, we're done. We can get families here. But oftentimes I find that to be incredibly ineffective for two reasons, because the time that's been chosen is usually at the discretion of the person organizing the event and their own schedule. It's actually not usually, unless sometimes the person's a parent themselves, it does work, but it's usually not flexible for families. But families have a variety of needs. So even if that one event works for some families, it's unlikely to work for all. And then this idea of offering childcare. There are many, many families in my experience, including myself, who want to vet the person, even if the person is amazing and we know that they're likely amazing, we want to be able to vet the person taking care of our children. So if you're an organization new to organizing families and new to meeting with families, if you do an event and you offer childcare, a lot of times folks won't utilize that childcare or feel nervous about utilizing that childcare. So what we do instead is have an integrated approach. So we choose spaces that are child-friendly and child-centered on purpose. And if we have elected leaders, we ask elected leaders to come to that space. We don't try to make it more accessible for them, with the exception of, we've done these fantastic games on the Capitol lawn with chutes and ladders and pre-K 1Ks, but still centering children and families. And I'll never forget, we had one member of Congress say to us once, well, can you keep the children quiet? These were toddlers, by the way, while we speak. And I said, absolutely not. Like, that's not something we can do, and not something anyone I think could do, particularly if kids are running around doing like a pre-K 1K, And so we really push back on elected leaders and really center families instead and say, what is the thing that's going to be most accessible to families here? And then we will bring the policymakers to that. And it often works better than any press conference because the visuals are amazing. It's easier for families to talk to their elected leader when they know that their child is there, they have their child there, but their child is also entertained and doing something that's fun. It also just makes it more real for the elected leader to understand, like to see it. There's something to talk to someone or to read data. It's another thing entirely to be with children, see children, and be reminded of the mission and why this is so important. But even with libraries in these different settings, I will never do an event where there's not a space for children. And so one of the things that we've done, even for low events where we've had less funding, I go to a children's library section and I ask them if I can do it there, because they're already set up for children. They usually have some kind of activity or books or something, and they tend to already be a warm space. I've done indoor playgrounds or playgrounds outside if the weather permits, particularly during the COVID time. Wherever you can create a child-friendly space and have an integrated approach to childcare. We have one or two people who are extra on hand to be able to navigate the children as possible and do activities with them. Even child performers, we've done child performers, face painting, all kinds of things. And it really makes the parents feel like they don't have to hide their children, that their children are part of this. We're families together, advocating together and wanting to create this change together. And that they're honored and that we love your children, we love your families, and we're here to listen to you. And those are always where the best conversations happen. And we often call them play-ins, we do, play-ins is usually what we call them, but we sometimes call them other things like around games or things like that. And I know I'm running out of time, so I want to so the things I most want folks to take away from this is fostering deep relationships with our members, with families, developing members as leaders by doing the work alongside us. And that's had real success points for us. We have a parent-made mission statement at our organization. We have concrete tools built by parents for parents about advocating with their children, about doing marches with their children, all these different things. We have hundreds and hundreds of media moments. We've had Moms Rising members reviewing grant applications for funding for childcare work. We've had families weighing in on federal legislation on the Child Care for Working Families Act and helping shape that directly. I mean, really, we talked to them about what was in the bill. They weren't reading the policy, but we talked to them what was in the bill, and they said, well, we think this really needs to be in there, or this is something that I don't think you've addressed that's really important. And we went back and we pushed back on that. Not everything made it in, but some things did, including dual language provisions, because our Mamas con Poder families were so passionate about making sure that there was language access, and we pushed really hard to get the dual language components into the Child Care for Working Families Act, completely based in parent conversations. Moms were at the heart of the $50 billion win for childcare relief funding. Well, I'll never forget the Ways and Means Committee reached out to us, and we had Julie Gross and Diana Limongi, two Moms Rising volunteers. Diana now is actually Moms Rising staff and leads our National Parent Fellowship Program to build parent leaders and resource parents to do this work. And Julie Gross was sitting there with her son on her lap, and she had lost her childcare. He was throwing Cheerios at the screen, and she was amazing and was so nervous, but felt really supported in doing it. And that testimony was cited so often as being the reason that some members of Congress really decided to start engaging in the work of childcare. It was that powerful. Lots of the Moms Rising staff, I mean, when we mean build power, we mean build power. And that also means hiring people onto our staff. A huge chunk of our Moms Rising staff are former parent volunteers who now are helping literally shape all the work that we do as staff. And then we've had, of course, we have fellowship programs. Moms Rising has, in addition to our storyteller programs and the Layer K components that I already talked about, and all these different ways that parents can engage with us on social media and online, we also have our fellowship programs, which are volunteer stipend programs where folks can go in deeper with us on the work and help weigh in on different policy components, or do really deep actions with us, or design their own actions that we support. We had several families do actions around Uvalde in their communities in response to Uvalde that were incredibly powerful, and we were able to support them in that. And I think I've covered everything that I really wanted to cover, and I'm eager to have your questions. I think the most important thing to remember is that when we create spaces that are welcoming to families, when we're listening to families, we're going to have more successful events at a very kind of practical level. We're going to have more successful outcomes. We're just going to have more successful and good policy by really centering those closest to the pain, whether that be families, right? Or that be providers. It's often not just parents, right? And I'm really excited now to hear from LaToya, who I'm just really excited to hear about your work.
Thank you, Nina. It was so great to hear about all the work that you do with Moms Rising. I'm a big fan of that work, so I'm excited to be on this webinar with you today. So, hello, everyone. My name is LaToya GAYL. I'm currently the Senior Director of Advocacy for Neighborhood Villages, but how I arrived at this work in the early childhood space is that I've done lots of advocacy work with families in the K through 12 space. And so I'm trying to bring some of that energy here to the pre-K, the early childhood space. And so I'm excited to be here. Valora mentioned at the top when she was doing my introduction that I call myself a social entrepreneur. And I'll tell you a little bit how I arrived at that space. And so I have helped found lots of movements and organizations, but the first one that I did, we called it Phenomenal Moms. And I formed that with me and a group of other moms that I met. And we came to that because we were showing up in spaces and trying to advocate individually for our children. And we were all moms of color, and the spaces were not very welcoming to us. And we found ourselves having what you call the meeting after the meeting, where we're talking about like what's going on here, and how can we get our points across? How can we get, the things that are important to us on the floor? And we decided to create our own space to do that, because what we did notice is a lot of times in the advocacy space, what I love about Moms Rising is the diversity, the intentionality about being multilingual. And we were trying to do something like that as well, because what we noticed is that there were, to be frank, a lot of like middle class and upper middle class white parents whose voices were the voices that were listened to, even though they weren't necessarily the majority of the families who were being serviced um, by schools. And so we said, how do we bring our voice forward? And we created our own organization that, and I also want to emphasize the importance of partnering with other parents if you are a parent, but partnering with other organizations. And I know there are a lot of practitioners on this call. And so it was really important for us that we partnered with people who had formal roles of power, who, people with a title behind their name, who were brave enough to partner with us. And so I would encourage anyone who is on this call who has some formal role or position to be brave enough to actually partner with families, because the magic that happens when you do that it's amazing. It's like Cinderella. Um, and so I also want to talk about what it looks like to make space. Valora mentioned that I've done a lot of DEI work, what it looks like to make space. And, um, you know, I know that even though that I'm a Black woman, I'm not a bilingual person. And so, I had the opportunity to be in spaces where everyone did speak Spanish or a language that I didn't speak, and experience what that felt like. And that helped me to be able to shape a more inclusive environment when I know that I was going to be in an environment where English was going to be the language that is mainly being spoken, but there are going to be people in that space who didn't speak that language. It's important, if you have the opportunity, to experience what it feels like on the other side, because I think a lot of times when we are designing events or meetings or things, we think we're doing a good job, and that's our intention. But if it's not being shaped by understanding what the experience is like, or having someone who can actually shape the experience for someone who needs translation or who comes from a different culture, what we do, even though it's well intended, won't land like we're intending it to land. So that's just like a bit of practical advice for that. And in the early childhood space, what I've been hearing a lot of from educators in the classroom is, we talk a lot about educators being under-resourced or underpaid, and we talk a lot about it being really expensive for families. And the truth of the matter is that neither one of those groups understand like why that is. And so part of the work that I am doing now in advocacy is helping educators to learn and helping families to learn. And we're actually launching a fellowship for educators and for parents to help them learn and to begin to advocate more robustly here for families. And so I'm really, really excited about that. And I also want to talk about what does it look like to actually be inclusive and not be tokenizing to families. I know myself, what disheartened me and honestly made me angry when I showed up in spaces to advocate for my children. I also didn't mention I have 4 children, and my youngest just turned 1, but my oldest is about to turn 19. So I have this range of kids. But what really angered me when I showed up in a space is how parent voice was disregarded, and tokenized, where people we'll let them say something, and then we'll do what we think is best because we have degrees and titles, and that makes us more important, and makes us, and it means we know more, when we know, Nina mentioned a lot of this, that's not true. And when you make policies, when you make regulations, when you make rules that are not informed and really shaped from the beginning, by the people who are impacted from them, they don't work. And so a resource that I want to bring up, and I think that we can share this after, is Charles McDonald has a framework called From Tokenism to Partnership. And it's really a framework that can help guide you in your engagement strategy and your engagement journey, about how do you move from tokenism to true partnership with families in your work. And so I'll share that after, so people can really look at that. And a big part of that is from the beginning, bringing the families in and not being afraid of the voice. His name is Charles McDonald. Not being afraid of what you hear. I've also heard people say we were afraid to talk to families because we thought we might be organizing against ourselves. You have to hear from the people, because what you think is a problem may not be what they think is a problem, or how you think that problem should be solved is not the way families think it should be solved. And I also want to work from a definition of engagement being the responsibility of a school or a program, and not the responsibility of a family. It's the professional's job to be engaging, not the family's job to be engaged, if that makes any sense. And so what does it look like for an organization? Nina spoke a lot about this, to be engaging. It means making things family friendly, and but having an understanding of what family friendly looks like from the perspective of a family. And that might mean it's okay, like you might hear my 1-year-old in a second, sometimes he gets loud. What does it look like to create a space that's actually welcoming if I have a toddler who doesn't understand quiet, and being okay with that, and for families to know that it's okay. What does that look like? It looks like more than just food. What are you serving? Like, people don't want to show up for pizza when they want their child to have a more nutritious meal. And so asking people what the time, the place, what type of food should it be? What should be available for parents? Making it be okay to say, my kid's going to be on my lap while we're having this meeting. And, if at all possible, do that yourself. Like I always say, if I'm asking someone to be vulnerable, then I have to do it myself too. And so I tell people, sometimes you'll hear my kid in the background. He just got home from school himself, so he's excited to be home, and so it's okay to do that. And I think it's important. Nina mentioned this about storytelling. I always say you have to be, as a practitioner, you can't, just to be frank, you can't pimp someone's pain. It is very hurtful for someone to share the same story over and over and over, and they're not seeing any change. And the question is, then why are we asking people to rehash things that are painful? Remember that storytelling is about pushing the storyteller's issue forward for change. It's not about an organization being able to show a fund or something. It's about the issue of the storyteller. And I think sometimes that gets lost, and families are smart, okay? And they get it. And that's why they don't want to share stories sometimes. And relationships. Nothing is actually more important than relationships. People show up for self-interest, but people also show up for people that have shown that they care about you. Um, they know people who know, like Nina said, when's your kid's birthday? People who know, what's going on in your life, what's going on in your neighborhood. I often say to people, I call it a blessing that I've been blessed to be able to work in the communities and live in the community. I get to live in the communities that I serve. And so I know that I have to do a good job because I might run into you at the corner store or at the park or wherever that may be. And those things are important. So I want to say kudos to Moms Rising for having so many former moms who they work with be on staff, because that's powerful, and that makes your work more powerful to be led by the people who are impacted. Just today, when I was interviewing someone to be joining our fellowship, I was so excited to speak to her when I saw her cover letter and her resume. And that's another thing. I told people, if you don't have a cover letter and a resume, don't worry about it. Just send me an email and tell me you're interested, because that's what's most important. But she was a little nervous and not saying, like, I don't know if I'm qualified or if you would want me. And I said, are you kidding me? When I saw her resume, she's a classroom teacher, she's multilingual, and she's a parent on top of it. And I think that lens, like, that is the lens that needs to be brought to advocacy work. That's the lens that needs to be in our classrooms. And so engagement, I talk a lot about advocacy a lot with our lawmakers, but also it's important that the relationship that you have as a practitioner every day with families, and recognizing when families may or may not be comfortable, and developing relationships with families so they see you as a resource to them. I know when I drop my 1-year-old off, um, I'm not dropping him off to somebody that I'm not comfortable with, that I don't feel like I actually have a relationship with them that I can trust. And so just in the way you do your work, to be open, to be kind, to be understanding to families, that itself goes a long way. And I think the most powerful thing in that is that we know that the practitioners who do this work, they're women, they are women of color. Um, and if that group of people and families together are advocating, I don't believe that there's anything that could stop them. And so it's exciting to bring those groups of people together. I know everyone I know that drops their child off to someone to care for them, trust that person. And if we could have that trust be a two-way street, that's magical, like I said before. And I'm getting my time is up. And so I think we're about to have a group conversation, so I think we can all turn our cameras on.
Thank you, Latoya and Nina. Very, very powerful lessons and stories that you're sharing, and also tips that you're sharing about how to get involved. One of the really sad things, and somebody's writing in the chat, is just really discouraging when families are feeling their voices aren't heard. And as you mentioned, sometimes it's that tokenism. But one of the encouraging things, Nina, is that you guys have 1 million members. And this is a time where people are saying, people won't join organizations. I won't name any of the organizations, but many of our early childhood organizations have been suffering from membership decline for a long time. It doesn't mean that the people aren't involved. It means that people don't necessarily join organizations. I think that's how people are interpreting it. But yet you have 1 million members. How do you account for that?
That's such a great question. I think it's a lot of that flexibility and that responsiveness. It's that combination, right? We don't expect every single, like, if we could do that grassroots relational work with 1 million people, that would be amazing. But that's not what it looks like in the day-to-day, right? Like, we have people who we're building deep relationships with, and then there are people who come to us at different stages of life. It's just a reality. Like, we'll have someone who comes in, is really active on childcare, but then the reality is that they still care about childcare, but then their child has grown outside of that, like, and then other things become, like, really pressing. One of the things that we most hear about right now is gun violence in schools, right? Because that's something that is so pressing right now. So I believe that that responsiveness and that flexibility around, you come to us when you're ready, when you want, right? You don't always have to share your story. You don't even ever have to share your story. Like, there are other things you can always do with us, right? We're here to help support you in your leadership in whatever way it feels comfortable for you. So that component, I think, but then also this piece around being a multi-issue organization, actually, I think matters quite a bit, which I know that not all organizations can
Mhm.
do, but there's just something about being able to reflect the reality of what people's lives are and their experiences, I think, in that way, that's really powerful. I will always care about childcare. I'm a childcare advocate, right? But I have to admit that as a parent, many of the things that are really catching my attention now have nothing to do with what I've been working on in the last couple of years. So, but I always know that I'm reflected at Moms Rising. Does that make sense? Like, because we're always listening and trying to adapt and change. And we don't always get it right. I won't say that either. I mean, I don't think any organization ever gets it right every single time, but it's that intentionality and that desire to listen and really be responsive to families, I think, that continues to bring people and to continue to build that power.
Yeah, that's so important. You know, I mentioned before, CAYL has a lot of resources. One of the resources that we put out is we put out a book about the Alpha generation. And one of the characteristics of the Alpha generation is they're very multicultural, multilingual, very different kinds of families, a lot of diversity everywhere. But, I think people know that on a head level, but on a program level, it's still hard for people to get to that. I was really impressed, Nina, um, that you were talking about that it's not just translation, it's also the programming. And then Latoya followed that up by saying, I'm putting myself in situations where maybe I'm the language minority. And so I experienced that. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about this multilingual aspect of the work that both of you are doing. Latoya, a lot of your organizations that you founded have really been focused a lot on Black moms, but yet you're very intentionally reaching out to moms who have speak different languages or have different experiences. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, our communities are like next door to each other. Like so I have friends, I'm married into an immigrant family. I have friends who come from families who speak other languages. And so I hear them talking, but I tell you the most life-changing, there goes my 1-year-old, sorry, banging. If you
No,
can hear.
sorry.
One of the most life-changing experiences for me is that I got to go to a talk. And the talk it was by an Afro-Latina woman. And the talk, she did it in Spanish. And everyone who spoke English had to wear those headsets. You know, those headsets that when you go to something and they
Yes.
say, there's
Yes.
translation in the back that they say in English. And I say, well, how do they know that they're saying there's even translation? Like, why don't they say that in the other language? How do they know? And so I really and it was life-changing for me to go in there and try to pay attention, because you see, I move a lot when I talk. And so and I'm a visual person. And so I'm trying to take in this dynamic speaker who's speaking in a language that I don't understand, and also trying to hear what somebody's saying in my ear to translate what she's saying. That is so hard. That is so hard. And the most of us who only speak English in this country have never experienced that. And so I said, that's not how this should be done. How could we design things? So sometimes when I have something, I say, no, you're going to have something like in Spanish is usually the language that we have it in another language. We're going to have it in there. Or when I've done things and you have it be parent led, the translation just looks different. When you tell people, take your time, we're not in a rush, and we're getting back and forth to each other. I think we're even picking up other languages. But just the care, and just to experience that, because I think if you don't have that experience, you just don't know how to do it, and you don't know what people are going through. And I have to tell you, if I didn't speak English, I don't think I'd be showing up at things where somebody's telling me, here, somebody's gonna be whispering in your ear for an hour. Just pay attention. I don't think I would show up. And so how do we design things when we
Mm.
talk about this country and the diversity of this country, right? How do we design things that are centered around the people that we say that we're serving and we want to impact? And I'll stop now, chit chat too.
Okay, it's great. Hey, everybody, do you want to talk with Nina and Latoya? If so, in just a few minutes, we're going to be putting a link in the chat, and you click that link, and then you'll have an opportunity to interact with Nina and Latoya yourself. These webinars are so fascinating. I always learn so much. I want to thank you, Nina and Latoya, for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge, and your strength with us. You've really encouraged and inspired me, and I know many of our listeners. As we're coming to an end here, I do want to encourage people to click the link so that you can interact with our speakers. And I think if you get any messages from what Nina and Latoya are teaching us, how important that voice is, the voice being heard from the beginning. Our two panelists have emphasized you don't make policies without involving people from the beginning and having them as true partners. And what happens is the families are stronger and the early childhood educators are also stronger. So we're getting stronger together. That is the call for action that we all have. It's really, really important to have that in our minds. And I also want to say that we want to make sure we have the impact. Having the impact really matters. So as we continue in this series for the rest of the year, we're going to be talking about impact, the impact of the COVID era on children. What do we really know? People are talking about how has COVID impacted. We're going to look at the research and what we really know for sure about COVID impact. Then we're going to look at the research on actually how the COVID era has impacted programs. And then, because there's so much talk right now about quality rating systems, we're going to look at the impact and what the knowledge base is telling us really about quality rating systems and the possibilities for change in those systems as well. So I want to thank all of you for once again learning with the CAYL Institute today. And why don't you join me? Click the link and let's talk to our speakers, Nina and Latoya. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll look forward to seeing you next month when we talk about what the real impact of the COVID era has been on children.